will begin at the beginning. And this is a sign I took a picture of in Holmrest region of Norway, near Holmrest Farm. And I was so surprised to see that there. And there was a Holmrest Farm on the north side, so Nordre Holmrest, and there was a Sutra Holmrest on the southern side of the road. And we visited with both the families that were living there, and we came from the northern Holmrest side. And that is a picture of Gerhard Holmrest. He was a young man who farmed in Delamere, North Dakota, and his family had immigrated about a generation before. And in 1947, Gerhard, just following World War II, had a great flax crop. And he was able to sell that flax for a lot of money. And so much money that what he was able to do was he bought himself a new Studebaker car. He bought himself a new Studebaker truck with a hoist. And he bought himself a Minneapolis Moline tractor and a new Minneapolis Moline combine. And then he bought land, and he decided to drive that Studebaker car to New York City, put it on a boat, and he and the car went to Norway. In search of what? I'm a little bit suspicious from reading some of his letters that he sent to his brother Clifford. But anyway, here's a picture of Gerhard Holmrest, and he went to Holmrest Farm, among other places. He was able to find it with the help of this young lady who he met along the way. And you were from the Alverum area. My mother was raised on I don't know if it would be a farm, but an area around Flisa, which is not too far from Alverum. And her father was a lumberjack. Anyway, my father showed up at her house at one point, and the result was that that they have a beautiful love story, and that's a part of who I am. They were married, and they knew each other for about 3 months. And at that time, my father had to get back to the plant, and and he was about 42, 43 years old at that point, but he knew what he liked, I guess, because he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. She left Norway and did not return for 35 years. And in the process, there were 5 of his children that were born. So there's a picture of Lily, and she immigrated, as I said, in 1948 to this country. She's pictured there on Lake Superior with her grandson, my son Nathan, and you'll hear more about Nathan because he's an important part of the story as well. Because what you're hearing today is it is my story, my involvement with the young Cumps. Well, I'm a father. I'm Nathan's dad. I now have 4 other children besides Nathan, and I was Bob Asp's friend. You'll hear more about that. I was a sailor, but I was a landlocked sailor for a lot of years, growing up on that farm in North Dakota. I grew up kind of loving horses and being a cowboy until I discovered sailing and the sea. I'm also a social scientist. I'm a psychologist by training, and a researcher. Part of my involvement with SHIP was trying to do some research. And of course, I'm a son and a brother, and there will be a little more about that after a little while. And also, I was a young man who was learning a lot of lessons about life, and part of that was learning about what was important. And I was one of the original 3 crew members. And in 1981, I was part of the Shakedown Cruises and the crew tryouts. And then in the fall, was selected as one of the crew members who would sail the ship on our voyage to Norway in 1982. I decided I needed to tell my story because we each have a story. And my story is a little bit different from my perspective than some of the other crew members. I was a dad, and also my story is told by me is a little bit different than it may be told by some of the others, and as you see in the video and that sort of thing. So Bob Asp fell off of a roof while he was roofing a house in about 1972-73, and he was pretty seriously injured. He broke some things in his body, and in that hospital bed, he and his brother Bjarne started looking at pictures of Viking ships, and out of that, he developed a dream. And I like Bob's quotes. He had a way of saying things. And one of my favorites is, Bob said, "To dream is every man's privilege. Some dreams are so remote that even the dreamer doubts that they will become a reality." And as I spent time with Bob, it was, I think, fairly clear to me that that's how Bob felt about this dream. That this was a pretty remote dream. And yet, Bob persisted. For 9 years, Bob Asp worked on building a Viking ship. During that time, he became very ill with leukemia, and that cancer did not relent. There were times when there was some remission, and Bob continued to work at his dream. And my first opportunity to know Bob came as a psychologist in an internship when I walked into his office, and he greeted me, and he told me he had something he wanted to show me. And so we traveled to Hawley, Minnesota, and went into this old, dingy building that was a potato warehouse, and it smelled like a potato warehouse. And it was dark. The floor was dirt, and he flicked on some floodlights, and just a great, big, bright smile came across his face, and down in front of me was just a row of wood, just old wood boards that were kind of fastened together, and there was about 80 feet of, just this whole line of wood. And he says, "Well, what do you think?" I looked at it, and I looked at Bob, and I looked at it, and I said, "What is it, Bob?" He said, "It's my Viking ship." And then he said, "And I need crew members." He said, "I need crew members for my Viking ship, so would you be willing to be a crew member for me?" Well, I looked at that line of boards, and I looked at Bob, and I thought, this is a safe bet. "You bet, Bob, I will be one of your crew members." Well, as time went along, Bob's family came alongside of him, Bob's friends came alongside of him, and even though he battled leukemia, he continued to work on that ship. So Bob didn't know how to build a Viking ship, but he was a devout researcher, and he was a detail guy, and he went after it. He went to Chicago, as I recall. He had a visit with folks, and he looked at that Gogstad ship. He measured that Gogstad ship. As a matter of fact, some of his measurements were pretty exact on that ship. And remind me when we get to that part after a little bit, because there was some relevance to some of that measuring that created a little problem for us on the maiden voyage. Bob went to the north woods of Minnesota. He went to Oak Grove Park over here, just northern part of Fargo, and he found the oak trees. He cut those trees down, and he made them into boards, into strakes himself. That's one of the most remarkable things about this story, is that he didn't go buy it at a lumber yard. He did it authentically. And he tried to do everything authentically with the young coast, including when it came to the oar hole covers. And you'll see, in the ship, on those oar hole covers, he tied them to, he tied closures or caps, to the oar hole covers with leather straps, because that's what the Vikings did. They didn't have a bunch of screws that you could screw in there. You had to tie those, oar hole covers down, keep the water from coming in. Okay, so Bob Asp, pictured here, wearing his Viking hat. He was a Viking captain. I was referred to him as Captain Bob. And once he had a chance to get the ship under sail, Bob never took himself too seriously. And one of the things about his building of the ship is that he had many doubters. And I don't know how many of you have taken on grand projects where the dream is so vast that even the dreamer doubts. But the doubters in the world weren't afraid to give him a hard time. And there were times when he was maybe not called a fool to his face, but he certainly got the inference from places. So dreaming is not always a painless process. What I appreciated also is his courage, tremendous courage. And there were a lot of people with tremendous courage that were part of this expedition. The crew members were men and one woman, Debbie Asp, and you'll see a picture of them after a little bit, who showed tremendous courage in being able to take on the sailing part of this project and to get her to Oslo. All right. I see Bob as someone who inspired many of us. He inspired his family, he inspired friends, and he's still inspiring people today. Not a small accomplishment. Rose Asp, Bob's wife. I refer to Rose as the unsung hero of the Young Coast. I call her my second favorite person. And I'd like you to kind of listen and pay attention as we go along, because if we have some time at the end, I would be interested in knowing what your thoughts would be about why I have Rosie pictured in this way, and why I've chosen her as the unsung hero of the Young Coast. All right. How many of you know what I'm referring to here? Okay, the Kensington Runestone. So, really, kind of ties into who can tell me why there was a Young Coast. What's the story behind the story? He's pointing to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway.
To prove that it could be done.
To prove that it could be done. Bob Asp believed, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there is a lot of time that can be spent on talking about the Kensington Runestone. But Bob Asp believed that Erik the Red, some of his gang of brothers sailed from Norway, came via Greenland and through the islands along Canada, sailed up the St. Lawrence or something similar, and that the water was higher at that point, and that they were able to sail all the way to Alexandria, Minnesota. And Bob was a firm believer and proponent that that's what happened, and he would have loved to have found a way to sail it from Alexandria if he could. So I see this as part of what to me has relevance is I don't know that will be proved. I mean, there are folks who have been trying to prove or disprove that for a long time. But I think that that's part of why I'm here. That's part of why the Yum comes, because it's part of our heritage. We as Scandinavian people, Norwegian people, have a heritage that we were adventurers, that we were leaders in the world, and that there was that experience, that there were Vikings here much earlier than that Spanish guy showed up. And so I see that as inspiring. I think it's something that helps to counteract some of the negatives that I may have gotten growing up as a child, because there were at that time insensitivities, to a lot of us, and one of the things I remember is the dumb Norwegian jokes, and people they have a way of kind of working through that. But as a psychologist, when I take a look at the messaging that can come through with some of that kind of thinking and language, it's not a healthy, and it's not accurate, in terms of our heritage. And it didn't have outcomes. It brought a balance, to our culture in our part of the world. Anyway, Bob Asp also talked about the dream is just a dream until that dream becomes a reality. And as I said, after 9 years of building the ship, and during those hardships, the leukemia looked, like it was going to cut it short. Things looked bleak for Bob in his dream until it wasn't. All of a sudden, it was real. Friends had stepped up, and that ship was ready to sail. At that time, Bob Asp came to me, and he said, he was in his office, and he called me, and he said, well then, my ship is ready to go. You said you'd be one of my sailors. Now I want to know, are you going to be one of my sailors? Are you able to do that? I kind of gulped, swallowed hard, because I had a little boy, 3 years old, named Nathan at that time. And also, I knew that Bob's interest was sailing that across the Great Lakes, all the way through, hopping on the Atlantic and sailing it to Oslo. That was a formidable, challenge, and there were many detractors, who said that was impossible, and there were folks all the way along that said that would, end in death for anyone who wanted to be foolish enough to participate. So, after some prayer and some thought, I realized that, as human beings, we have opportunities that come along in our lives. Not lots of them all the time. I mean, for some of us, there are lots of them, but for most of us, true opportunity is something that we don't necessarily see, and we don't recognize the true opportunity when it's there. And I looked at this and I went, wow, this is a $50,000 adventure that is being offered to me to be a part of. And so I told Bob, I'm gonna sail it with you. I said, I'm a dad. If there's a point at which it looks like my sailing of this ship is going to interfere with my being the dad I need to be, then you'll have to have yourself and the rest will have to carry it on and do the rest. But I'm going to help while I can. Bob said, fair enough. My next story is the hardest part of this for me to tell. Remember I said I was a brother. This is a picture of my brother Tim. And on the eve of the Youngkomst being sailed in Duluth, I had just gotten to my mother's house on a motorcycle ride. I walked in, the phone rang. My older brother, Devon's son-in-law, Gary, answered the phone. And I watched his face, and it turned white. It was ashen. He mumbled some things into the phone. You're sure? Okay. And then he turned to us and he said, Tim is dead. He drowned in the Gulf of Mexico. My world went dark at that point. And I thought, no. I called Bob. I said, my brother is drowned. I won't be able to help with the ship. And Bob was understanding, supportive, very concerned. And he thanked me for the call. And I thought it was done. I did a eulogy at my brother's funeral. He was a wonderful young man. You can see he was a football player. He turned the heads of young women in his time. And when I said that at his eulogy, drew a lot of laughter because they all knew what I was talking about. So, as the funeral ended, my mom looked kindly at me with those sad, sad blue eyes of hers, and she said, she said, you can't do anything more here. She said, why don't you go and help Bob sail his ship? I'll take care of Nathan. You go. And I realized, I hadn't even thought about it, but I realized, that compassion that my mother showed for me, but especially for Bob and for Rose, and her sense of purpose really spoke. She believed in this, and this is something I should do. And so I did. I threw an old tent that was old and didn't have the pieces it needed, into my Cutlass convertible, and I hit the road and I went to Duluth, and I got there about midnight. I ended up, trying to put up that tent in the Spirit Mountain campsite among the bears and thunderstorms, and I'd never camped before. I didn't know you had to pay someplace and get a campsite. I just pitched that tent in the middle of a bunch of other people in the middle of the night. Anyway, I got up in the morning and I rounded up Bob. I found him down at the harbor, and he was glad to see me. And so it was time to sail the ship. And one of my favorite stories is the day that we took that ship out under sail for the first time. And the thoughts I have are, if you've been to Duluth, there are bridges around, and the cars were stopped on the bridges. I'm sure that there were a lot of accidents that day. Because these cars were stopped, people were hanging over the rails, watching this ship out in the harbor. under sail for the first time. And some people were fortunate. They were in the restaurants on the piers, and they're having lunch watching the Viking ship, and I imagine they thought they were the luckiest people in the world. And so as we cruised, I was, as I said, one of the 3 original crew members. Debbie was, at that time, still in high school. Bob thought she was too young. And Larry Mullen was the captain. He did not end up making the crew, but he was skippering at that time. And he invited Bob to come to the helm and take the helm of his ship as we'd had it under control. And I look back, and I was running, the lines, the ropes on the starboard side of the ship, just forward of where the helm was. And I was able to look back, and there's a bit of a platform there. Bob was on this elevated platform at his ship, and he had his captain's hat on. And it is a memory that I'll always treasure, because the look in his eyes, sailing his dream for the first time, was magnificent. He forgot all about the pain, all about the leukemia. No, those were gone for that moment. And that ship cruised, beautifully, gallantly, across the harbor. So that process was probably 10 or 15 minutes under a wonderful sail. And as we were nearing the end of the harbor, coming close to some of those restaurants I was talking about and people sitting out on the pier, Bob kind of came a little more back to reality. He says, well, maybe we better turn it. And Bob was a builder. He wasn't a sailor. So he told Larry, come on back up here, will ya? You help us turn it. So Larry took the helm, and he pushed that tiller bar, to the starboard to bring it around. And lo and behold, it didn't come around. And well, this is a little unusual. So he brought it back again, and he pushed the tiller bar forward to bring the ship around, bring that bow around. Well, we're getting a little closer to these people now having lunch, and they're just starting to back off a little bit on the railings there. And basically some of us crew were thinking, okay, ramming speed. I mean, it was getting pretty tense. And so we tried again, and it was the first flaw that we had found in the ship, because there was a problem turning the young humps, and we had no clue what the problem was. But we had wind coming across our starboard bow, and she was heeled over. It should have come right around. So we had some quick fingers in the crowd. I don't know who they were. Maybe I was one of them. Under those circumstances, you do what you have to do. I grabbed a front line, and I threw it out to one of the boats. It's like a 20-foot runabout that was out there. I think a relative who was out taking pictures of the ship, and we threw it and said, fasten it and pull us around. So here's this 76.5-foot Viking ship being tied to a little runabout, boat. And we're thinking, what are we doing? What are the chances of this? But it was enough. It was just enough. And the bow came around, and we were able to sail that ship back to its harbor, pull it back, and put the sails down. And at that time, we didn't have oars. We had oar holes, but there were no oars, yet with the young humps.
What was the problem?
Remember, I said something about the builder and the measurement of that ship when he was in Chicago measuring the Gogstad ship. What Bob did was he measured the rudder. He measured the rudder and the rudder length. But he did not take into account that that rudder was based on a ship that had been buried, along that shore for 1,000 years. And in that process, they didn't get the length right. And so the rudder was out of the water. There was no way we could turn the ship, because with the sails, hewing, the boat over, we didn't have a rudder in the water. So anyway, one of my favorite stories of Bob and our process. So, Bob Asp died that December. He had sailed his ship, and yet at that time he lost his battle to leukemia. Just for reference, his youngest son, Greg Asp, died several years later of an auto accident on his 21st birthday. Rosie passed away in 2002, and another crew member, skipper, Eric Runestone, died in 2010. So, a little bit of history. Okay, this is Nathan at age 4. We had a job to do because Bob wanted that ship sailed, and so the family decided that that was exactly what it was going to do, and they set about having crew tryouts and sailing tryouts in Shakedown Cruises in the summer of 1981, of which I was a part, and Nathan was a part, because I was a divorced person and a single dad, and I had Nathan with me. That was kind of how that worked. And so he was able to come along, and the crew kind of took him on as the Young Comes mascot, and they taught Nathan a lot of things. As you can imagine a Viking crew would do. They taught him how to cuss, they taught him how to camp, they taught him how to smoke cigarettes, and that didn't last too long. And then Rosie also was along, and Rosie decided, I think I'll help out with Nathan, a little bit here. And so Rosie and I had a very special relationship. Rosie and Nathan had a very special relationship as well. But he was able to be the youngest crew member. So I want to talk about the Shakedown Cruises. And these are the cruises that we did on Lake Superior in the summer of 1981. And it was the work of choosing who was going to sail the Young Comes. There were about 300, as I understand it, men who sent applications. There were a lot of guys who came and spent some time on the ship who were interested in sailing the Young Comes. The originals, besides myself, were Mark Hildy, who became first mate, and Jeff Solom. And Jeff was the radio operator and the youngest crew member, along with Deb. They were both 18 years old. And Jeff still races on Lake Minnetonka. So, now during the Shakedown Cruises, I learned something that I consider to be important. There are lots of things I learned that were important, but this one was having to do with kind of the safety, because one of the things we think about with sailing ships, sailing boats, is that there's a certain amount of danger. And with the Viking ship, how many of you would have thought of that as being a dangerous thing to do? I mean, it's a beautiful thing to do, but let's be real. It's a pretty dangerous thing to do. If you look at the gunnels here, it's about up to my mom's waist. This is my mom and Rose, Asp, and a couple of other crew members. Tom and Jeff Solom is the guy without the shirt on the right. All right. there's about 3 feet of freeboard, you know, on a Viking ship. So the water line, no, would have maybe 3.5 feet, you know, on the other, on the water side of the ship. So we thought maybe we should do a little bit of just practice on a safety drill. If somebody happened to fall overboard, incidentally, where do you think we went to the bathroom on the ship? And don't say you just held it for 3 months.
Buckets.
If you had a bucket and then you wanted to go with an audience, you went with the bucket. You're right, but most of the time it was over the side, and that's one of the things that I also think about is there's not too many of us who have been able to say we've actually peed on a museum piece, but you know, there are a few in the crowd. And what our exercise was, first mate Mark Hildy said, okay, I'm going to throw out this orange buoy. I want 5 of you, and he named us, I was one of them, watch that buoy with, don't blink. Just watch that buoy constantly, and we're going to see how long it takes us to sail back to get to this person who's, with that buoy. Fair enough. Now, part of the reason for that was we knew that Lake Superior was very cold, about 46 degrees, that we would lose consciousness in about 20 minutes. And probably go into shock before that, but we would lose consciousness. And fair enough, we thought we need to get back there pretty quick. So, Mark threw the buoy out, we're watching. And the crews, they're both square rigged sails, but you can see this one is probably pretty square. It's about as wide as it is tall, maybe a little bit wider. And so Erie Canal was solicited to come and do trial sailing with the Youngcomes by Tom Asp. And Tom Asp became the person who really was the expedition leader of the Youngcomes. It was I think he was the youngest son, but he had an engineering background, and he brought Erie over, and Erie then went about deciding these sails are not going to be efficient, we need new sails. And so that's why the ship that you'll see in most of these slides is a more streamlined looking Viking ship. So Erie also added a topsail, and Roger Asp and I went out into the forest around Knife River where we were camping, and we found a big, strong looking tree, cut it down, and that became our topsail yard. And that's what, there's the main yard and the topsail yard.
What kind of tree?
I'm pretty sure it was a pine, tree. What exactly, what kind of pine exactly, I don't know. But it was, and it worked. It was a little fresh, but it worked. The other thing that Bob hadn't thought was necessary was he had thought it wasn't necessary to have ballast. Ballast would be the keel or the weight to keep that ship balanced with the power of the sails. And so we didn't have ballast when we were sailing it. Fortunately, we did not have storms during our trial sails, or there may not have been a Youngcomes. Because one of the first things that Erik Rudström did was he said, no, you need ballast. So we hauled 8 tons of rock from Lake Superior shores to the Youngcomes, and we put it in the hold of the Youngcomes. And that took a few days, and some pretty back-breaking work, but that was our other lesson. All right, we had things ready to go. It was May 1982, and it was time to depart from Duluth. We were celebrated, we were paraded down the streets of Duluth. The governor was there. Anyone remember who was governor at 1982 in Minnesota? It'll come to me. Anyway,
Jesse.
go.
Jesse?
No, it wasn't Jesse. I don't know. But anyway, and they had bands. They had a big celebration at the convention center, and as the day went on, I had Nathan with me, and Nathan clung to me with everything he had. And what I hadn't realized was that I was staying, at the campground as we were preparing for this departure. Nathan had been staying with Rosie and my mom and Rosie were good friends. And he would watch the TV shows in the evening, and the television reporters were interviewing the old sea salts, from Duluth, the old sailors, and they were talking about how this ship is never going to make it across Lake Superior. This crew is going to die, and and they're extremely foolish. And so I didn't know that he'd been fed this kind of message. But when I handed Nathan, finally, he'd been on the ship with me, when I handed him to my mother, he was like a limp dish rag. And that's pretty hard, for a dad to kind of, to take. That didn't feel quite the way I thought it was going to feel. But we departed from Duluth, and we sailed magnificently out of the harbor. And if you've been to Duluth, you know that there's a lift bridge that has to go up, and then you sail through kind of that lift bridge channel. And as we did that, we calculated just a little bit short, and as we came through, we were very, very close to the sides of that channel, and that's a concrete wall. So all of us were against that channel, trying to fend off the ship and get her through without scraping the daylights out of that beautiful finish. And then we were out into the main part of Lake Superior, and the Vista Queen followed us out. As we did that, the wind died, and we were sitting there, and the Vista Queen just kind of came and sat close to us. And it was a time that I am talking about because the family was on the Vista Queen. Nathan was on that Vista Queen, and what I remembered was Nathan saying, "Goodbye, Daddy. Goodbye, Daddy," over and over again. And I remember Deb Asp came and gave me a big long hug, and it was just quiet. And finally, we got the oars out, and we rowed the ship, I don't know, about 6 miles up into the night, and got to Knife River, because the wind never did return.
How many people do you have on board?
We had, at that point, we had 13 on board. 13. Okay, this is a picture of, as we, we're trying to figure out how things work. If you see that little roll of toilet paper there, Tom is on a little pooper, a super duper pooper, we call that. And it's a more comic relief than anything. No one really put that out there as we're sailing along. But the main idea, yeah, that was how going to the bathroom worked. And I remember countless times as I would be at the helm and somebody would be at the bow, and we'd get these fluffy floaters coming by, as we're going. And again, the instructions were you put a life jacket on and you fasten the life jacket to a life cord and you tie that cord to the ship, because it would be pretty crazy to be trying to do something without making sure that you had some level of precaution there. All right, here's a picture of another couple of crew members, Myron and Dad. Myron Anderson became an attorney, and he owns some businesses in Minneapolis. Deb lived in Northfield, I think, and Faribault area, and Rosie lived with her there, or lived around her there until Rosie passed away in 2002. So, just a picture, with Rosie. Rosie thoroughly enjoyed being on the ship, sailing with us. Rosie became a good friend. There's a picture of Paul Hess on your right, Eric Rudstrom on the left. Dennis Morgan is back at the helm, and Paul was the navigator, Eric was the skipper. Bob was the captain, Eric was the skipper, and yeah. So the next one, this is Bjorn Tore-Holtet. Bjorn is from Narvik, Norway. He's one of the 3 Norwegians. It was Erik and Bjorn and Vegard Heidi. And Bjorn was interviewed after that a little bit by a TV reporter, and the TV reporter said, well, what do you think? I mean, what do you think when people say that you guys are just crazy? You're just crazy doing this thing. And Bjorn looks at him and he says, they're not crazy, they are adventurers. And I loved it. I thought, yeah, that was exactly the answer.
Were one of the Norwegians brought over as a consultant? I thought Deb said in her talk that you needed somebody to help you fix the flaws, and you brought over somebody from Norway.
That would be, yeah, that's Erik. Erik, came over because Erik was able to redesign the sail, and he redesigned the mast also. He needed to have a mast that was going to hold that larger sail, and then also to be able to support a top sail. And so that was all part of Erik's design. And then also we redesigned the rudder to be able to extend deeper. As you see the ship over at the upcoming center, you'll see that new design also on the rudder. And then Bob's son, Roger Asp, who was one of the crew members, did do the work. And Bob, and so part of that ability to work with wood that Bob had, and really showed up in Roger. He was great at being able to make those changes to the ship. Oh, that picture is it's just kind of one of those silly pictures that you get lucky with. But Igor is the dragon head, with the horns there, and on Lake Superior we ran into some pretty serious storms, and the dragon head just about busted off. We were able to get up to it in time and bring it down. And so he had to kind of lean in there and decided, let's just take a picture. All right. We departed from Knife River on May 11th, 1982, and the crew members are Mark Hildy from left to right, Mark Hildy at the helm, Deb Asp, Eric Rudstrom, Dennis Morkin, Tom Asp, that's Roger Asp next to Tom, Jeff Solom, our radio operator, there's Paul again, who is the navigator, and Vagar Heidi. Vagar was never there for the trial at Shakedown Cruises. Vagar was chosen later because Tom had gone to Norway, and you'll hear that in the story that you see tomorrow. And he had met Vagar, and Vagar was really kind of the star sailor of the Young Host. Without Vagar, I don't know that we would have made it. There were so many times that we were negotiating, navigating treacherous, difficult waters with lots of rocks and problems. And Vagar, was the one who was looking at the maps, and he was the one who was taking us through. So I have a story about Vagar and I in New York, if we get to it. Anyway, then it's Dennis Morkin, and there's Bjorn, and then Myron Anderson below. Okay. As we sailed off onto Superior, we had hopes and dreams, and had several of the crew members sat that out. Tom and Dennis had other things they decided needed to be done, and so they didn't do Lake Superior. As we set out into Lake Superior, it was quiet at first, and Roger continued to work on finishing the crew quarters, making that tent that you see down there. We found a place, for Inga, who was the dinghy that we had along. We wanted to get off the ship and check out the ship. Or then Igor was the name of the dragon tent. While we were sailing Lake Superior, you were asking about water coming in. There's a crack that we didn't realize that developed, and how that came to light was I was at the helm, and as we sailed into the night on Lake Superior, first of all, we found a dense fog, and fog comes when you have no wind, and so it was time for sleeping, and we would alternate every 6 hours in terms of our watches as crew members, and during my sleep time, it was probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard some loud horn blasts. And this was a new sound to me, so it awakened me, and I wondered, well, what is this? And as I listened, I heard crew talking about we were in the shipping lanes, and that means there's a freighter someplace out there that's warning us that we're in his way. And the problem with that is we have sail power, so we have no power to move out of his way. And a 1,000-foot freighter doesn't move around like a runabout. And then I started to hear something I had not heard before, and that was what I figured out was the sound of propellers. And at first the propellers were really kind of quiet, just lipping and lapping at the wave, at the water. And they got louder and louder and louder. And it was pretty hard to wonder, where is the ship? And we didn't know if that ship was going to come right through the middle of us, for what was gonna happen. But eventually, it sounded like it was maybe just a little bit further away. And then we listened, and that was a very warm, reassuring feeling to hear that propeller kind of drifting out. So the next day, the wind came, the storm came, and we're under full sail. We had the top sails still flying, and we had a great sail going. I was at the helm, and we had the ship heeled over at probably 30 degrees. And so that's a pretty nice slant, for our ship to be. And I was having a ball until I looked down, and all of a sudden, out of the crew quarters where the other crew members were sleeping, floated Bjorn. And he was just kind of down underneath me, and he's in his sleeping bag, and he looked up, and he said, he put his hand down into inches of water, maybe 6 inches of water. And he looked up, and he spoke in Norwegian most of the time, but he did speak English. What I gathered was, what in the daylight is going on? And of course, that was the first we had figured out about the crack that had developed in the hull along the forward, the hookups for the hoses along. And so, as that was happening, we were getting more and more of the storm. The wind was increasing. I don't know how many knots we were at this point. The waves, maybe, we had 7, 8 foot waves. And as we sailed the Youngcombs, we were sailing northeast. The wind was out of the northeast, and the Youngcombs was 76.5 feet long. What the Youngcombs did is it was just the right length to be able to catch every wave, and that's part of what contributed to that, crack in the hull, because it would bang into each of those waves. At this time, we had a lot more action on the ship, and some of the crew got seasick. Well, this was not the time to get seasick, because we needed all bailers available, and I was near the end of my shift. It was time to sleep, but I was also the medical officer, the chief medical officer, so I was handing out the MARF banks were right over the gunnel, but I was handing out the Dramamine. Well, it was a little late for Dramamine, but I decided I was fine. But I took a Dramamine because I thought I want to be fine, because somebody's got to sail this ship. And as we proceeded through the night, we fought the storm. And the other thing that we figured out was, remember I talked about those leather straps on the oar holes? Think about this. You got oar holes placed about halfway down that 3 foot mark. So when you're heeled over, where's the water line? The water line is at the oar holes. And so we had water pouring in the oar holes, because guess what? Bob's desire to be authentic was a wonderful thing. It was great. But if the Norwegian Vikings had done it that way, I don't know that they would have been able to build the reputations they had, because leather stretches, and it stretches a lot. And so we had water pouring in the oar holes. We had water coming in the cracks. We had Roger trying to fix the oar holes. We took down the sails, the topsail. Taking the topsail down was not an easy thing to do in that kind of wind. Did not want to come down. And the topsail then went into Lake Superior. And as it went in, it took on water, but it's fastened to the yard arm. And so now it was pulling the ship over. And I like to tell that story because I think it really helps people understand some of what we went through. And why I say that that it really did measure people, and it took a lot of courage. It took a lot of courage to get back on that ship after a stop in Sault Ste. Marie, which was, the end of Lake Superior. It took us 7 days to get across Lake Superior. Okay, I'm going to speed this up a little bit.
Did you have running lights?
Define running lights.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
port and starboard.
Well, we did. But yeah, they weren't particularly bright, and they weren't adequate. No, but they were there. This is a freighter, and on the Great Lakes, we encountered a lot of these freighters. I was steering the ship on Lake Erie. We had been through the day before. We had 6 tornadoes around us as we were sailing, and we didn't know we had 6 tornadoes. We just knew we had absolutely crazy weather going on. And we had sheet lightning. I've never seen lightning like that before or since, coming down in sheets. I thought one of those hits the mast. I mean, it cuts it, it's over. We had dropped the sails and just weathered that storm. We had to put out a sea anchor to try and maintain our position so that we didn't get swamped by the waves on Lake Erie during that storm. And then I think it was the next day, we're on our way to Buffalo, New York, and I was at the helm, and we saw a freighter coming at us, and I asked Mark Hildy, the first mate, because he would give me instructions about where to steer the boat. I said, should I start to go below it? Should I go to its aft? And Mark says, hold your course, because I was going to go sail in front of it. Okay, so I'm watching, and we're not making good progress here, and this freighter's just cutting closer and closer. I Mark permission to go to aft, and he says, hold your course. I held my course, and then in about a minute, we had 5 sharp, loud horn blasts from the freighter. That means imminent danger, get out of my way. And at that point, Mark looks at me and says, go to aft. And so I changed my course, and I went to the back, tried to get to the back of that ship. And literally, again, we were so close that those sailors were all lined up against the gunnel of their ship looking down, and they must have been from a foreign country because they were doing sign language with us that I understood completely. And we just missed the propellers in the back of that ship as we sailed through. And there wouldn't have been anything we could do if we would have hit it, except hopefully they would have picked us up out of the water. All right. We sailed on to Buffalo. At Buffalo, it was time to take down the mast, take down Igor, because we had decided that while the St. Lawrence Seaway may have been the way that Bob had figured that the original Vikings had come, sailing down the St. Lawrence Seaway was going to take us out into a lot of icebergs and into some pretty treacherous area. And so we opted for choice 2, which was to go through the Erie Canal. So we, this is a picture, just looking down with the mast down. We got some rowers from one of the rowing clubs in Buffalo, New York, to row the ship. That was an activity they wanted to do, so they rowed the ship to the beginning of the Erie Canal for us. And the Erie Canal, shown here, was a really interesting part of the ship. There were a lot of friendly folks who were greeting us. And how do you think we traveled through the Erie Canal? How did we make it? The sail was down. What was our power? We had volunteers. And that was one of the things Tom Asp was so good at. He was such an organizer. He had organized those boating clubs all along the Erie Canal to give us a tow. And they were, oftentimes, they were not big boats. They may have been like a 25 foot power boat, but they would pull us along. And in the areas we didn't, you didn't hear it from me, but 9.5 horse Mercury. We did have, someone had donated a small Mercury motor. Roger Asp had figured out how to get that motor to fit it to the young constant. And believe it or not, it worked. 76.5 feet with we were like 16 ton of boat and ballast, and we did run aground once or twice, but got out of it. So as we traveled along, there were some of the bridges were lift bridges that had people. There were people everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds of people came out to watch. They gifted us. It was raining things like burger baskets, cases of beer, and water. I mean, they were throwing money. I mean, sometimes those quarters and half dollars hurt. They'd also throw dollar bills, and I mean, it was a really interesting time. But we were celebrated so much by the people of the regions as we went along. Children came by the busloads. These buses came and schools let out school in order for kids to be able to come and see this history in the making. And so it was really quite a fascinating experience to be a part of that. I don't know if you've ever seen, what a canal lock looks like, but there you go. That's before the doors open up. When we would go in, we'd be at the top of the lock. They would drain that lock down, 20 feet, 30 feet, and open the doors in the other end, and away we'd go. And we did about 36 of those all the way along. So it was, some of the time it was raining and challenging. Just a quick look, take a look at the tail when you go over there. Gary Olson was just a magnificent wood carver, and what he carved there, he's carved the dream, the building of the boat, the dream, and the reality of that ship, and it's a beautiful work on that tail.
Kind of appropriate, you had a lot of volunteers, because that's how the canal got built originally.
Oh, is it?
Well, yeah, a lot of farmers would come and they would dig out what abutted their land, and everybody thought it was a folly, the government wouldn't support it, but it made lots of money when it operated.
Interesting. And more people showing up. I have a quick story. There's a Frenchman, and this Frenchman came up to Deb Asp and I as we were sitting on the ship, as we were probably at one of those locks, and he walks up and he looks up at me and he said, wow, he says, you guys are amazing. He says, you got balls this big. I never forgot it. He meant every word of it too. You got balls this big, so okay. Take the words right out of my mouth. Paul Hess, he's selling books and greeting people. you may not have known this, we sold books. Bob Asp had written a book. Well, we sold books for $3 wherever we went. It was part of our job as crew members because we had to eat. and that's part of, when I think about Rosie, I mean, how do you feed this crew? How do you, how does that happen? Pardon?
Drinking water.
Drinking water, yeah. The drinking water was, in big plastic, water containers, we had along. But for the ocean part, no, that was an issue. Again, children would come. There's a picture, taken with Deb and I. And I think what I came to realize is that we really were heroes, to these young people. And there was a humbling part of this whole thing, realizing kind of that weight of how we were acquiring a form of fame without really, even recognizing or realizing that. Get to the Hudson River. Hudson River was chilly and cold, and it was warmed up by yacht clubs. The yacht clubs all along the Hudson River were really, really interested in having this Viking ship and its crew come and celebrate with them. So there was belly up to the bar, guys, and I got plenty of those stories. But this particular time, when we were to sail down the Hudson, we were supposed to be in New York City in the morning. And in New York City in the morning, Tom Asp was already there. He was going to be part of the Today program, and they were going to have the helicopters from the Today program viewing the Yumkunst, and it was going to be the Yumkunst arrives. And so the problem with yacht clubs is that you can get drunk, hanging around a yacht club. And so, I won't say who, but there were two of us who were sober enough to cruise like a Norwegian down the Hudson. And it was Paul Hess and I. Paul was the navigator, and I was at the helm, and I won't forget it because we were dodging concrete pilings put in the middle of the Hudson River. I don't know what for, stability or, to keep people like us off. And then we'd go under bridges where there were even bigger pillars that were out there to get us. And it was night. I mean, it was like we left the yacht club at midnight, sailing through the night, and Paul would yell, bring it to starboard, bring it to port. I mean, I had no idea if I was coming or going. And there were times where he would be yelling, we're going to crash, or, and somehow he didn't crash. That's why I say it was really just plain luck. And we were crazy Vikings at that point. That was being pretty crazy. But in the morning, there we were. We made our way, and we were sailing under the Washington Street Bridge, and I was exhausted. Paul was exhausted. It was time to change command. And so Eric took over. Now Eric was there, and his wife had shown up at the last yacht club, and she was from Norway. He was from Norway, remember? So here's Eric, and he's going to sail the ship. So I didn't care who was going to sail the ship. At this point, I was going to lay down. So I tried to go lay down in my quarters. And as he's sailing, all of a sudden I hear a lot of shouting, and it's mostly in Norwegian. And so I couldn't sleep through that. So I walked out, and we had the ship full of people. I mean, Rosie was there, Greg was there, reporters were there. I mean, we had doubled the population on ship. We didn't have enough life jackets, much less did we know where the life jackets were. And we had the twin trade towers, off on our port bow, and we didn't have experience sailing around skyscrapers. And so what actually happened is that we had sailed in close to shore, and we hadn't noticed that they had these huge metal pilings And these huge metal pilings are along the Hudson River, and they're still there. I was there last summer and I saw them because I wanted to check those things out again. They looked bigger before. When you're up close, they look pretty doggone big. And these pilings are out in the river probably 200 yards, maybe 300 yards out. And their purpose is to break up wood and debris that can get in the way. Well, we happen to be wood and not debris, but the pilings didn't know. And we were headed right for these pilings. We were in an 8-knot current in the Hudson River, pulling us quickly towards them. And Eric was shouting out commands left and right in Norwegian. In an English-speaking crew, we had no idea. Then he started cursing in Norwegian, and I only know that because the other Norwegian says, "Boy, he's really cussing a lot, but I'm not sure what we're doing." And what had happened is we got too close to shore. The wind had been cut off, by the skyscrapers, and we were at the mercy of the current, drifting sideways toward those pilings at 8 knots with a load of people. And the picture was pretty bleak. I remember that Myron Anderson and I went to the bow of the ship. We grabbed fending poles, which were just poles that had been oars that we had broken trying to row someplace. And we went to the bow of the ship, and we were going to fend this 16-ton of Viking ship off of these metal pilings. And I remember thinking, there are things that you do that are pretty futile, but this seemed like one of the lamest. And so as we did that, Myron was thrown up on top of a part of the ship, and then he was knocked back down again. I was just trying to fend and getting no place, and then all of a sudden, the yard arm had been lowered. First mate Mark Hildy said, "Lower the sails." And I think it was just a desperate move, lower the sails. In doing that, he had created a giant fending pole because the end of that yard came up against that metal piling and was enough to push us away a little bit. We still got ripped. We still got gashed on the port side, but it didn't take out the whole port side, which is what it would have done without that fending off of the yard arm. And we made it through. We had helicopters flying overhead. We raised the sails. Now everybody was cussing at the helicopters because they were throwing the sails and the mast all over the place. And we sailed on past the Statue of Liberty.
Did you go to that Red Hook area where all the Norwegians kind of settled? Is that where you wound up next?
Well, okay. Where we ended up next was at the South Street Seaport Museum. As we sailed past the Statue of Liberty, we sailed into the Statue of Liberty, into the South Street Seaport Museum, which is the south part of Manhattan. And that's where Roger was able to make repairs on the gash in the hull. Now, as we came to the South Street Seaport Museum, what happened was that I was at the bow and I jumped off carrying the tie-down lines, and I think Myron also had a tie-down line, and so I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a photographer there from the New York Times. He snapped a picture of me. Ended up being a full half-page picture of me looking pretty naked. I had a pair of jeans on, and that was about it. And that I didn't even realize was there. But as we settle in to the museum, and it's just off on the left over here, you can see the twin trade towers also just off to the left. As we settled in, I was helping on the ship. We had we had a lot of tourists coming on. We had like 500 people that, you know, at a time that were looking down, seeing what we were doing. Well, Eric decided that his wife, Gerta, wanted to have us make her a hot dog lunch. Here we are, we're in New York City, and he wants us to make a hot dog lunch. Now let's go out and buy a hot dog, you know, but, so Roger and I were gonna light the stove, and I had a big, you know, 5 gallons of water, we're gonna cook it up, and I was standing there with Roger, we're just, you know, I got the water, and he's lighting the stove, and all of a sudden, boom, we had flames shooting 30 feet into the air, and Roger and I were thrown back into the crew quarters area. Roger is screaming, "Put me out, put me out," as he is on fire. And the kerosene or the fuel oil had, you know, bounced up onto him. And fortunately, we had just taken out some fire extinguishers, so some of the crew grabbed fire extinguishers and were putting the fire out there. I had the water, and I was trying to get it on Roger because he was really burning, and I didn't realize I was burned in the process, but not nearly, you know, like Roger was. And they then put Roger out more fully by using the fire extinguishers. Have you ever been around a fire extinguisher with CO2? Ooh. You can't breathe. I mean, that's why the fire goes out. There's no oxygen in it, and so Roger and I are suffocating here in the crew quarters, trying to get this taken care of. So that was one event that occurred, and then like a day later, I was paged. Here I am at this museum, this pier, and paging Lynn Holmrest, and I thought, ooh, ooh, why? You know, please go to the service area. Well, I didn't know where the service area was, but somebody got me to it. I found a phone. On the other end was an assistant Broadway producer. And he says, "Is this Lynn Holmrest?" "Yeah, this is Lynn." He says, "Well," he said, "I'm with the Broadway production of Valhalla. We're interested in talking to you. Would you be willing to meet with us if we come down there? And, you know, and anybody else who's willing to talk?" I didn't have a lot on my agenda, so I said, yeah, that sounds fine. So the assistant producer brought his producer, and we met with the folks at Broadway, and they wanted to have a little bit of this for that. They had some ideas, they had some money to donate to the Yum Comes, visited with Tom and Rosie, that was all good. And they asked me, "What is it, that you think you guys, we can do for you? Is there anything that we can do for you?" Well, my mind, as quick as a flash, went to, we have never been to a Broadway play. Maybe you're the guys, huh? And they said, "Absolutely. We're going to take you to a Broadway play." And they picked us up in limousines, and they did it in style. They took us to see Annie. Now, I've been praying, during this time. I've been praying because I had this little boy, and I hadn't forgotten about him. And part of the work that I was doing was trying to stay in touch. I talked to my mom. She said, "He's stuttering. He's missing his dad." And I talked to my son, and he didn't want to get off the phone. But we didn't have cell phones in those days, so this is collect calls back to Grandma that are going on. But I talked to Rosie, I talked to Tom, and I was just wanting to know what God's will was for me as a dad and as a crew member. And Annie was the play. So Annie was where we were going. This was the day before the ship was leaving, before it was departing. And this is the story of Annie. Annie's little orphan Annie and Big Daddy Warbucks. And you know what that message is? The message is that there's nothing more important than that relationship between that dad and that little girl and that child. And I had my answer. At the end of that play, I had my answer. And so I just had to tell the rest of the world, and that was a little challenging, but that was the point at which I let them know that my responsibilities as a dad were going to stop me from doing that ocean part of the voyage, but that I was willing to continue on as crew member, helping in whatever way that I could. Tom Asp had a lot of things that he wanted me to do, and so I was able to follow up in that way. Now, we are nearing the time here, and so, like I said, I have a lot of material, but I want to just show a little piece here. Rose Asp said goodbye to that ship as it left New York. I was on that tugboat with Rose, and there was a reporter there from the Tribune, Minneapolis Tribune. He took a picture of me as well, and Rose. And what Rose said is, this scene depicted is that she said goodbye. She said goodbye to Bob. She said goodbye to her children and the ship. She showed tremendous courage, in my estimation, because she let her kids continue. And that was her dedication to her husband, was to fulfill that dream. And it was a tough time for Rosie. It wasn't an easy time for me to let go of being involved in the sailing part of the ship, but I knew it was the right decision. That reporter from the Tribune asked me what I was feeling, and I said, well, I won't be a hero. I'll be a dad. That's okay. And this depiction on the front page of the Tribune, interestingly, ended up being hero armrest. So it had a little bit of a different twist on that. We came into Bergen, Bergen Harbor. It was a tremendous celebration. When the ship was coming across, we were involved with the media. The media was waiting eagerly, and then it was a speck on the horizon. Gradually, that speck grew, and before we knew it, the ship was there. The crew members had climbed, to the yardarm, and were shouting with just joy and excitement. And it was a tremendous time of celebration. The Norwegian ships came out to greet the Jomkomst. Nathan was invited onto the ship and tossed around and celebrated. He was there, and I was there as well. So here's the ship coming into the Pier of Honor in Bergen, and that's Huckins Hall. That is the King's Castle. Here's a picture of the crew receiving a phone call from the President of the United States. Here's their reaction to that call from President Ronald Reagan at that time. And here's the reindeer feast that followed. And I have lots of memories. But I'm going to stop, I think, with that, because I think you folks need a break. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share with you. And if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer.